Hello, in this video, I want to continue some of the series that I've been doing with space privatization. I really enjoyed talking about this resolution because I think that the way that it's written and just the general, just idea of the resolution and the core topic for the resolution are things that, I think I'm really engaged in, just have a really good understanding of from my own experience debating on space topics and just the kind of time and thought that I've put into the concepts that go into, a lot of the space topics that have been constructed. I think that one of the areas that I've kind of been a little bit light on, I think, in other resolutions that I want to kind of do a little bit more investigating on, because I definitely think there's an interest for it, is thinking about how postmodernism is really affecting a lot of these resolutions. And so for this particular series, I want to talk a little bit about Jean Baudrillard and his ideas about simulacra and simulation in the context of the space resolution. I think there are a lot of really interesting ways to talk about how Jean Baudrillard fits into the space resolution. Kind of like I've said with a lot of other criticisms, the idea of space is not just kind of space in a vacuum. It really becomes tied to various ideas about science and technology, their political uses, their cultural uses, what they mean to us as a society. And I think that a lot of the kind of questions that sit in terms of how this science and technology will be used, what does it mean socially and culturally, can really be answered by a lot of the arguments that Baudrillard is making. I think there's a lot of room to kind of critique the way in which a particular relationship to space by privatized entities is kind of constructed by the kind of relationship that Baudrillard is trying to pull about the relationship that simulacrum has in terms of its ability to kind of create the real world process or a simulation of the real world process, and our understanding of the kind of a way in which the originals of a lot of the things that we're talking about no longer exist, and how they're kind of constructed by these kind of cultural forces that are enforced by the imagery that comes along with our terms of investigation of space. So in this particular video, I want to talk a little bit just about what are some of the most central arguments that Baudrillard makes that are pertinent to this resolution, what are some of the ways that it's used on the affirmative and the negative, and just kind of use that as kind of the central construct for what we'll be using for a lot of the other videos. I think that in general, when I'm thinking about just what are some of the central constructs of what is relevant from Baudrillard in the context of a lot of this stuff, I think that when you're really trying to think of thinking what Baudrillard is really writing on, it's that it's so much about the way in which symbolism and culture and media has a particular way of constructing a shared and public understanding of particular events, and the way that simulacra is basically meant to depict things that either had no original or that no longer have an original, mean that there are some really interesting ways to talk about what these concepts mean in the context of the space resolution as a whole. The space resolution and the kind of relationship that embodies towards what we think about finding out about new worlds, new science and technology, are about the ability for us to kind of dispel our past kind of limitations on our relationship to travel and our ability to just be in the world, right? Because it assumes that we're kind of limited to our existence on Earth, and I feel that a lot of the things that kind of come with this space resolution is kind of the unlimiting of our capacity to only have to live on Earth and be dedicated to the limitations of living on Earth. The thing that comes along with that also is that the kind of ability for space to evolve as a particular field of science and technology has meant that there has to be the kind of invention of new ideas and ways of using technology that didn't exist before. And so thus a lot of the ways in which the kind of cultural impacts and the way in which the public kind of perceives a lot of the science technology that is created in the face of the space race is often done with the inability to really explain how these things exist outside of the usage of science fiction or other fictional tools, and thus these kind of symbols and signs replace the kind of reality and meaning that are kind of all around us. It means that it kind of starts to unfold how our human experience is starting to shape our relationship to the Earth and to the processes that come on Earth. I then think that this means that there are a lot of really interesting ways to talk about why Baudrillard may be pertinent for this resolution, because I think that the kind of particular relationship that the science and technology has in a particular media has a lot to do with what the public think is important in terms of what our values should be, where we should be looking to next, and how we should kind of be orienting ourselves culturally. If you think about how much science fiction, nuclear war imagery, and all those things kind of run the Cold War, then there's a lot of really good arguments to kind of make historically that really situate Baudrillard in the resolution in terms of how the resolution is kind of asking and repositioning a lot of the context for the space race in this particular resolution, even though it's not really talking about a negotiation between nation states. This resolution is really about, particularly about the private sector and its kind of relationship to just the public uses of space as a whole. But a lot of the arguments that are made in terms of why the private sector is particularly bad is because of the way it kind of destabilizes the international stage in various countries from being able to have an equal kind of investment into space, and also having a kind of healthy relationship to the ways in which we develop space at various types of stages. I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways in which a lot of the arguments that can be made in the context of Baudrillard is about why the kind of hyper-capitalistic and scientific imagery that comes from the private sector is not dispelled when we move into the public, but it's one that is actually kind of like re-incited through the use of like public usage, and how it's able to show like the common man as something that's able to kind of like ascend into space, and why that's particularly useful in being able to kind of like guide some of the kind of like ideas for like how we're able to think about like what space should be. And I think there are a lot of really interesting arguments to make in terms of like why the particular imagery that is produced when the public is able to gain access to the space isn't this kind of like white community ascension into like, you know, the kind of like heteronormative family that's able to exist and like survive in order to like populate and create the new human population outside of space, and being able to make arguments about like why those dreams are tied to various sources of like science fiction and things like that can be really interesting ways for you to kind of like understand like how these relationships get really complicated by a lot of the questions of like what the kind of like symbolic and power of the resolution is. And I think there are a lot of really good arguments to make about like why the particular framing of like the public as kind of like net better, or as new expansions that happen by the government as net better, is like ones that kind of set up a lot of like the kind of like artificial science that kind of like goes into things like the creation of things like the challenge of disaster, and the simulation of like the kind of like threat and like the danger of space is part of like what kind of like makes the challenge of disaster like so coercive in the context of like how we think about like space imagery and the sacrifices that are made in the context of like the American public or just the public overall. And I think that making arguments in these types of places about why particular instantiations of political reform in the context of these things definitely are reforms that happen at the level of like content instead of form. And I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about like why, if there's any way that we will kind of like survive our relationship to space, and like how we won't like drive ourselves towards like death through the like expansion that comes from like our particular relationship to space. And there are a lot of arguments to make about like how Baudrillard's critique is really fitting in terms of like really creating and operationalizing a particular relationship between humanity and like the death drive and its relationship to like how we're able to think about the cultural and symbolic effects of like what these kind of like concepts are doing in the context of simulacra, and why they're particularly like dangerous in the context of like what they mean in terms of representation, which makes it all the more pertinent the question of like what we do in relationship to how we test those things in the context of fiat. And thus like will really open up a lot of like interesting debates for this particular argument on the affirmative, on the negative, and against like critical and policy teams. Hopefully this video is helpful for you as a good intro to like what Baudrillard will look like on the space privatization topic, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing talking about Baudrillard in space. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.